The new GC-45 shell was nothing short of revolutionary. By lengthening the 155mm gun barrel slightly, the shells were soon capable of flying 1.5 times farther than conventional NATO shells.
When you've increased the range of the gun, the benefit is this. You can put your own guns back where they're safer, or you can fire deeper into enemy territory. And because one gun can command more ground, you can cover the area with less number of guns.
Before long, artillery guns based on Bull's designs appeared all over the world. The Israelis used them to protect the Golan Heights. During the Iran-Iraq War, the Iraqis bought over 500 artillery cannons based on Bull's design, and they were used to devastating effect. In 1984, Bull teamed with Dr. Charles Murphy to publish a book about superguns. During his research, he became obsessed with the long-range Paris gun. He managed to get many of the secret German documents on the Paris gun project from friends at the Krupp factory. Using computers, Bull ran calculations to learn all he could from the design and wartime employment of the gun. During this time, he immersed himself in the subject of World War I. He often toured the battlefields outside his office in Brussels, Belgium, and read poetry written by soldiers during the war.
He would walk through the graveyards, reading the little crosses and reciting his poetry, sometimes on his own, sometimes with one of his sons who went with him. And he would cry, and a great many of them are marked known only unto God. There's no name, no one knows who lies there. The reason is that they were blown to pieces by artillery, the very work that he was involved in. And I really think that he did not make that jump of realizing that the pieces he was producing new little crosses on some other land. He was producing many weeping widows and mothers, as had been produced in the First World War.
When the Iran-Iraq War ended in 1988, the Iraqi military was looking to rebuild its artillery systems, and members of the Iraqi government approached Gerald Bull.
And in those conversations, he began to tell them about his life ambition, which was to prove that it would be possible to launch a satellite with a huge gun at a fraction of the cost.
No Arab country had ever launched a satellite, and the notion of an inexpensive gun system that could fire satellites into orbit appealed to Saddam Hussein. At long last, Gerald Bull thought he'd found someone who shared his vision.
With their financial backing, he set down to develop the greatest gun that anybody would ever have seen. It would have weighed 2,100 tons. I mean, can you imagine the size of that?
Bull borrowed from his harp gun design and opted to build the barrel in segments. In all, they would stretch 512 feet long, nearly 1.5 times the length of a soccer field. The gun would be so powerful, it could fire a 2-ton rocket-assisted shell into orbit. The Iraqis codenamed the gun Project Babylon, but there were concerns at Dr. Bull's company. Iraq was embarking on an unprecedented arms buildup.
I did disagree with Project Babylon. I said it was a dangerous project. My objection to the supergun project were political, much more than scientific.
When his son convinced him that his super gun could be seen as a military weapon, Dr. Bull decided to build it discreetly. The gun was fabricated in separate parts by factories in England, Spain, Holland, and Switzerland. Many manufacturers were led to believe they were working on a petrochemical project for the Iraqis. Bull's supergun was now a secret gun.
But he didn't keep it that secret because he talked a lot. He didn't understand the dangers of loose lips sinking ships.
My dad was probably the worst secret keeper in the world. He was a very enthusiastic person. He would talk.
As word leaked that Gerald Bull was getting a second chance at his lifetime dream, pieces of the gun began to arrive in Iraq, upsetting the delicate balance of power in the Middle East. As a component of Project Babylon, Dr. Bull designed and built a smaller gun, nicknamed Baby Babylon, as a prototype for the larger supergun. This 40-meter-long gun was first constructed for horizontal testing. In the summer of 1989, the Iraqis installed the prototype at a secret site at Jabal Hamran, 90 miles north of Baghdad, in central Iraq. The gun was positioned along a mountainside at about 45 degrees, an angle which didn't seem appropriate for high-altitude gun research. As long as they kept funding Project Babylon, Dr. Bull agreed to assist the Iraqis with other weapons projects. These other ventures led him down a dangerous path.
My dad was a bit politically naive, and they tagged that project along. They did fund the project, okay? But meanwhile, they were asking increasing things from him.
Bull designed a number of advanced mobile artillery systems for the Iraqis that would use supergun technology. Perhaps the most ominous project Bull worked on was the long-range Iraqi Scud missile program. For Saddam Hussein, the major trouble with his Scuds was their restricted range and accuracy. Like the Paris guns of World War I, they could hit a city, but not an exact target. To carry a heavier warhead, they also needed more power.
They did ask him at one time to validate some of their work, a missile program in which they basically took some Scuds and put them together.
They needed, they felt they needed, a long-range missile, a missile that could really threaten Israel. They didn't have that. What they did have were large numbers of Russian Scuds. And they felt that if they tied enough of these Scuds together, they would change them from being a short-range missile into at least a medium-range missile. And Bull agreed with that.
Bull assisted the Iraqis with some of the mathematical calculations in their multi-stage Scud rocket program. It may have been a fateful decision. Israeli intelligence agents were following the project closely.
On at least 2 occasions, the Iraqis tried to launch one of these cobbled up, tied together missiles, and they failed. But sooner or later, they were going to be successful, and the Israelis knew that. And friends of Bull, people that Bull had known for years, who were associated with the Israeli government, and certainly some of them, in fact, were at the time members of the staff of the Israeli embassy in Paris, visited Bull in Brussels and talked with him at some length in secret meetings. Now, we don't know what happened at those meetings, but Bull's colleagues have told me that he emerged from them a very worried man. I think the Israelis realized that he was frightened and that he might stop, and they wanted to encourage that. And strange things began to happen to him. He lived in a small apartment just out of the center of Brussels. He arrived home one day and the furniture was rearranged in his apartment.
There were little gestures, you might say, nothing that would identify an assailant, but enough to unsettle him.
He did complain about a lot of these things, but not in a way to say, oh, gee, somebody's trying to warn me.
Meanwhile, Dr. Bull and the Iraqis continued to test fire the Baby Babylon gun. Bull became increasingly nervous. He was drinking during the day and taking sleeping pills at night. His every move was now being watched. On the 22nd of March, 1990, his assistant dropped him off at his apartment. He was carrying $20,000 in cash. Inside, he rode the elevator to the 6th floor and stepped out into this hallway, where a killer with a silenced pistol waited in the shadows of an alcove.
Bull turned left to his apartment door, fumbled for his keys, got his keys out, and in fact had put the key in the lock. The person who had been standing in the alcove then stepped out behind him and fired 5 shots in a straight line right up his back. He died more or less instantly in a large pool of blood on the floor.
Shortly thereafter, Gerald Bull's body was discovered. His money had not been taken.
It came as a total, entire surprise, and it's a shock, and you don't believe, you go into denial for a little while, and then it just sinks in, and then you're at loss. It takes a long while to heal from that.
The Belgian police believe the assassin ran down the stairs, walked out through this back garden and into a waiting car. Most experts believe that it was a government-sponsored execution, but which government may never be known. Some believe the Iraqis no longer trusted Dr. Bull, perhaps fearful that he gave the Israelis details on the supergun or the Scud missile program. It could also have been the work of Israel's secret Mossad.
He had many enemies, international enemies. The one that makes the most sense is Israel. The visits from the Israelis fit the timetable. He himself felt that it was the Israelis who were threatening him, and the circumstantial evidence would seem to point to that, but you could never prove it.
Acting on an anonymous tip, the British Customs and Excise Department seized the final 8 sections of the supergun in November 1990. During the Persian Gulf War, Israeli concerns over the Scud missiles were borne out. The Iraqis fired their Scuds at Americans in Saudi Arabia and Israelis in Tel Aviv. After the war, United Nations inspectors raced to the sites of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction and blew up a number of biological and chemical weapons plants. When they arrived at the supergun sites, they discovered baby Babylon still intact.
There's a secondary buffer system.
The inspectors went to great lengths to ascertain the capabilities of the supergun.
The requirement, according to the Iraqi declaration, was to fire a 600-kilogram projectile about 1,000 kilometers. That was if you look back at the work that Gerald Bull did in HARP, that's quite achievable. And with this size caliber and a rocket-assisted projectile, it could certainly push towards low Earth orbit.
These sections of the supergun barrel were found in a final staging area. The UN team determined that Project Babylon was a weapons program that destroyed the remains of the guns. Building a supergun this size may never be attempted again.
I've got a feeling that Gerald Bull was to guns what Werner von Braun was to rockets. They really wanted to build the biggest and the best. And at the end of the day, it didn't matter who paid the money, so long as they could realize their crazy ambitions.
In the end, one of the tragedies of Bull was that he didn't understand that the technology to which he was tied, gun technology, had passed. The day had passed. He was very jealous of a development in the United States at Lawrence Livermore, where he knew that they were thinking of building a gun which would be capable of sending small payloads into space, particularly for use with the development of a space station.
The SHARP light gas gun at the Lawrence Livermore labs in California uses compressed hydrogen to launch an 11-pound projectile to speeds nearing 9,000 miles an hour. A methane gas explosion propels a piston down a long pump tube to compress hydrogen to 30,000 pounds per square inch. The launch tube is connected to the pump tube at a right angle. Initially, it was thought that this would make it possible to pivot the launch tube to a vertical position, but the gun has yet to be pointed skyward. Still, it bears the acronym SHARP, which stands for Super High Altitude Research Project. With a space station in orbit, an inexpensive means of supply would be an attractive notion.
Suppose you forget some small piece of equipment